First I'd like to thank the organizers, Susan Reed and Barry Taylor, for the opportunity to participate in this excellent seminar. I'm happy to have literally crossed the world to be here with you today. My talk is centered around the initial results of an ongoing research and book project for Oxford University Press, in which I'll discuss the representations of handwriting in 19th century French culture. As my title suggests, I'll be focusing on the instructional books on handwriting produced at the time. In his 1839 article, De la littérature industrielle, Sainte-Beuve, a famous French critic, deplored the fact that publishing a work in print was becoming less and less a distinctive feature, and that everyone at least once in their lives would have their page, their speech, their prospectus, their toast published. Although Sainte-Beuve's views on widespread authorship and publishing may be questionable, his diagnostic of the intense expansion of the publishing sector is nonetheless insightful. Indeed, he captured how, in 19th century France, printing was becoming a fully developed industry. During that period, inventors found new, less expensive, and more effective ways of making paper. New legislation progressively modernized the production and circulation of texts. Faster mechanical presses were created and integrated into increasingly autonomous and segmented publishing businesses. The number of print shops exponentially grew around the country, growing from 506 in 1811 to 4,006 in 1911. And while some of them remained precarious or attached to traditional models, others constituted veritable book plants. In other words, highly productive and advanced workshops characterized by a rational division of labor. Accordingly, the production costs progressively declined, making printed texts more accessible than ever before and turning newspapers into successful mass and global communication media. By the 1900s, the industrial expansion of print was undeniable, with the number of printed materials in circulation in the country being estimated to have increased approximately 25-fold between 1840 and 1910. Literacy and writing were, unsurprisingly, key elements in this period. Writing education helped disseminate the skills necessary to nourish the print market of an increasingly politically and culturally active society characterized by strong demand and production of text and information. But not only that, in a two-way dynamic, the same fertile print industry also played a crucial role in expanding and developing literacy instruction. In the case of France, the production of educational materials was in fact one of the most successful publishing sectors of the time, benefiting directly from the new market opened and controlled by the progressive organization of public schooling, as Jan Sordi explains. A range of handbooks, guides, copybooks, and textbooks responded to this rising demand for education and consequently became one of the key instruments of French society's engagement with writing. In that sense, the history of handwriting in this period is inseparable from the plethora of printed publications that accompanied and propelled the expansion of literacy and the development of scribal education in general. Amongst those publications, literacy and calligraphy instruction books, more specifically, are invaluable source materials. Despite some recent scholarships, such as Anne-Marie Chartier, L'école et l'écriture obligatoire, or in the Anglophone context, Tamara Thornton's, which is not that recent actually, Handwriting in America, these publications remain relatively unexplored. This is surprising, especially since they represent a crucial source for understanding key aspects of the cultural history of the period. More specifically, handwriting instruction materials provide an entry point for understanding how writing was viewed in the age of print and literacy expansion. In 19th century France, the editorial market of copybooks and textbooks embodied multiple conceptions of handwriting. as a diverse set of images, practices, and ideas linked to scribal culture emerged from them. The changes in access to literacy and schooling, the development of calligraphy, the evolution of printing techniques, and the expansion of the publishing sector propelled the ways in which French society engaged with writing and transformed this script into a subject open to continuous investigation and exploration. Books dealing with handwriting instruction assumed many forms and presented different approaches to script, comprising practical, symbolic, historical, theoretical, and normative elements. They guided learners at all levels of writing acquisition and education, from the initial steps of shaping letters with a pen to the practice of more sophisticated techniques targeted at producing regular, elegant, or artistic hands, using efficient writing postures and advanced pen movements. Literacy textbooks, for instance, focused on teaching the first steps of writing by explaining and demonstrating basic concepts and techniques. They tended to use calligraphic knowledge to outline the essential elements of manual writing, from holding the pen to tracing fluid and regular words or sentences. For the most part, they also indicated, or at least suggested, the specific educational context in which they were supposed to be used, in official school settings, in private learning environments, in groups or individually, with or without the presence of an instructor. Consequently, their content was normally conceived as part of a curriculum or program, presenting a learning pathway with tasks and information being presented in a progressive manner, from the simplest to the more complex. Although the teaching strategies and the approaches and order of the elements presented could vary. That is the case, for instance, of Favarger, who used calligraphy as a tool for a systematic approach to writing in his L'écriture en 25 leçons. Other authors like Jean Midol presented, however, a more artistic approach to script. Born in Besançon in 1794, Midol was a calligrapher instructor who had an active career not only in France, but also in other parts of Europe, notably in Switzerland. One of his main publications, Œuvres de Jean Midol, published around the mid-1830s, aimed primarily at showcasing his complex creations and his unique artistry. Works such as those of Arnaud Berliner, another skillful calligrapher and illustrator based in Strasbourg, sit somewhere in the middle between handwriting instruction manuals and calligraphy art books. Delving into relatively complex techniques and scripts, his Cours complet de tous les genres d'écriture usité en France, it's a long title, presents both a well-crafted illustrative plates with detailed drawings on how to prepare the quill, as well as fine depictions of the principles behind the different refined hands to be copied by learners. This varied production of writing instruction books underscores how handwriting was an intellectually fertile subject, propelling all types of responses and approaches. The work of Auguste Guillaume Taupier is particularly emblematic of the richness of this type of publication. Taupier was one of the most influential calligraphers and writing educators of his time, having authored an extensive list of handwriting manuals published for the most part in Paris between the 1830s and the 1870s. Born in Bordeaux in 1798, Taupier returned to calligraphy after quitting his military career in 1829. His works were promptly adopted in the years following the 1833 Guizot Law, which is one of the main educational laws that will make education a systematic policy in France. His method figures, for instance, alongside those of Verdet, Lavaux, and Casters in the 1835 official catalogue issued by the Royal Council of Public Instruction, determining which books should be adopted in normal primary schools. While the following decades, especially the 1850s and 70s, in France were marked by political instability and regime changes, Taupier's books continued to be a constant presence in the country's educational system, as they also progressively adapted to technological changes, such as the growing production and use of metal pens in the second half of the century. Thus, in December 1863, under Napoleon III and the Second Empire, both la calligraphie Taupier and the écriture cursive, écriture ronde, were listed in a decree by the Minister of the Primary Education, Victor Duruy, as reference writing instruction materials to be used this time in primary education institutions in general. Taupier's manuals display a heightened sense of detail in their description of the writing act and of the written word. His manuals usually start by decomposing writing into basic elements, outlining its initial steps. In his Cours d'écriture en 20 leçons, that you can see here, for instance, the first 4 lessons provide a sequence of elementary definitions and terms that will be fully practiced and understood only later in the course. After having analyzed and named the aspects of the ideal body position, how to hold the pen, the different types of hand and arm movements, and the inclination of writing, he enumerates and carefully defines the multiple types of pen strokes, or effet de plume, that make the letters and the links between them. However, Taupier was equally able to integrate this detailed analysis, focused on a general understanding of the elements of writing, with a more practical and procedural aspect. In the subsequent lessons and their respective plates in the same book, the author exclusively proposed guided and specific writing exercises. Throughout his career, Taupier increasingly integrated discussion and practice in his manuals. In the small and oblong format of the Cours d'écriture en 20 leçons, discussions and exercises were printed in separate sections. In later works, such as the Calligraphie Taupier, elements of discussion and practice tended to share the same space on the page. In this instance, explanations, diagrams, examples of multiple hands, marked lines for practice are combined in a complex, large page layout, creating a more cohesive didactic unit for each plate in the book. Taupier would hint at the reasoning behind this amalgam of elements when explaining his approach to the round and cursive hands. He affirms that being created, and this is a quote, being created mainly for the school setting, his method had to be economical, fitting as much content as possible in one page. And yet, Taupier writing instruction books achieve yet another level of complexity. The Calligraphie Taupier covers multiple stages of writing instruction, from the basic tracing patterns to full sentences and epistolary and receipt templates. These copying exercises touch multiple subjects, from beautifully written phrases with advice on the principles of good handwriting, to short moral teachings on topics such as modesty, or even examples of ornamental designs. But beyond that, around 1860, Taupier's method had substantially expanded into a network of publications, which he described in detail. So the first book is a general method, like all others, which provides all the theoretical and practical means necessary for teaching. The second method consists of 4 notebooks to be traced out in ink. The third method, the guide for these other methods, gives in black models and exercises, etc. And finally, a fourth method comprising the model transparencies, which give the same exercise as those of the notebook to be traced out in ink. So Taupier's multi-volume project demonstrates not only a clear view of the different dimensions of writing education and the complexity of scribal knowledge, but also a heightened awareness of the commercial dimension involved in publication of literacy and calligraphy books in his time. Writing instruction was clearly at the heart of this expanding market, both in the private and in the public sectors, targeting the lower and the upper classes in cities and in the countryside. This is why it is common to see in these instruction books references to the author's credentials, mentions to official government approvals, or the famous families or institutions in which they were used. Similarly, we can better understand Taupier's recurring references to the low cost and accessibility of his books and to the effectiveness of his method in multiple settings. Not surprisingly, equivalent remarks will also populate many other manuals in circulation. Indeed, if Jan Sordet argues as Jan Sordet argues, the organization of public education opened up a formidable market for publishing, from which the production of textbooks profited first and foremost. Writing manuals would not escape the competitive commercial logic underlying this context of expansion. The development of the French school system was thus more than a contributing factor to the continuous growth of literacy. It was the basis for the development of a consumption network for printed instructional materials. After decades of formal education expansion, by the 1880s, more than 5 million boys and girls were enrolled in schools all around the country, which is approximately twice the number of students in the 1830s. This expansion and institutionalization of schooling helped create a series of established avenues connecting consumers and authors, sustained by a recognized body of agents, editors, publishing houses, educators, periodicals, and authorities that controlled and produced and disseminated educational books. Sorry for the, yeah. I thought this was the good resolution one. Apparently it didn't convert well, but I think we can have an idea at least. So the general school manual production will therefore constitute an active publishing market, as exemplified by the large number of titles published between 1867 and 1890. So these numbers here are taken from another research by Alain Chopin, a well-known historian of education in France. Taking a closer look at the specific case of handwriting manuals allows us, but this is general school manuals, right? This is school textbooks in general. But taking a closer look at the specific case of handwriting manuals allows us to better understand the nuances of this particular slice of the educational book market. But uncovering the specifics of the production of calligraphy and literacy manuals is far from a simple task. Many of these books were made for use, not for conservation. They were written on, taken apart, shared, and replaced regularly. Therefore, the pathway from the school table to archival preservation for this type of material is not linear. Incomplete, used, miscatalogued, and underrepresented sources are abundant, especially in the case of the more practical, inexpensive copybooks. However, in the French case, institutional awareness around the history of education, symbolized, for instance, in the creation of the Pedagogical Museum by Jules Ferry in 1879, may have helped to associate school books with valuable materials worth preserving. Perhaps for that reason, it is still possible to find a plethora of these books in the catalogue of France's largest library, the Bibliothèque Nationale. Unfortunately, there is no specific section or category in the catalogue that unite the sources. To identify handwriting instruction books within the library's vast collection, my approach was twofold. First, an initial list of titles emerged by search in the catalog for printed materials published between the 1800 and 1914, associated in title, description, or subject with terms such as calligraph, écrit, script, scribe, manuscrit, autograph. So these were the keywords that I've used, with the ending being open to other possibilities. Then, as some of the sources found in this initial stage were linked, for instance, to other works of the same author or to works of similar nature, it was possible to refine and expand the list of titles. This is just a snapshot. After a careful process of verification that prioritized entries with clear information regarding author, date, place of publication, and publisher, it was possible to compile a sample of 211 handwriting instruction books published between 1810 and 1914. Here, we must be cautious to avoid the trap that Andrew Pettigrew calls the convenient untruth of bibliography, which consists of thinking that what survives, and this is Pettigrew saying, what survives in libraries today offers a representative sample of what was originally published. While not perfectly reflecting publishing production, this list of more than 200 handwriting manuals offers a large pool of educational materials on handwriting and presents some interesting trends. We can see, for instance, that while many of the handwriting instruction books that survived in the catalogs of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France were published by large educational publishers like Hachette, which still exists to this day, the role of smaller independent publishing initiatives, which account for approximately 15% of the total sample, should not be ignored. So that's the case of writing masters publishing their own work, or partnering, creating partnerships with small printers to publish their own work. Similar, the role of smaller cities, such as Strasbourg, may point towards a dynamic, widespread diversity of handwriting instruction book production that includes but also bypasses the predominance of Paris as France's main cultural, editorial, economic, and political center. A visualization of the places of publication clearly shows how the production of books on handwriting, while centered around Paris, echoed in fact all around France. Another important phenomenon emerges if we consider the publication dates for these titles. Here, the period between 1840 and 1870 appears to be the most fertile in terms of variety. So this is the quantity of different titles per year. Over 130 different books on handwriting, approximately 65% of the total sample were published within that 30-year period. Again, we must bear in mind that such fluctuation may be a reflection not of the period's publishing activity, but of the many variables that mark the acquisition and preservation of archives in general and of the Bibliothèque Nationale in particular. However, the conditions of production may also help explain such numbers. On one end, so at the beginning, the expansion of education since the 1830s arguably opened a market of new opportunities for calligraphers and writing instructors in the following decade. On the other hand, the decline in the number of titles after 1870 might also be a result of the increasing systematization of education and the educational curriculum since the 1860s, which further defined, through legislation and policy, the books and methods to be used in public schools and how they were chosen, thus potentially setting the stage for a progressive reduction in terms of diversity of titles released. Additionally, this decline may also be a consequence of the larger trend identified by Frédéric Barbier, taking place in France from 1880 onwards, in which the publishing sector saw the number of copies printed continue to expand, while the growth in the number of titles produced tended to shrink. However, it is still possible to observe that by the end of the century, there's still room for fertile competition between different titles. In 1889, an official publication by the Ministry of Public Education, titled Livres scolaires en usage dans les écoles primaires, so school books used in primary schools, lists the school books adopted all around France and provides crucial insight into that scenario. It reports a total of 50 items used in writing instruction, including a range of materials from textbooks and copybooks to wall charts. Notably, authors and publishers such as Clerget, Colombel, Dubuis et Lemaire, Flamand, Guédage, Godechaux, Delamarche, and Manoury appear to be leading figures competing for national predominance in the realm of writing methods. So this is just a snapshot of the most used instructional books of the time. As the century progressed, approaches to writing instruction increasingly focused on simple effectiveness to the detriment of elaborate penmanship. The works of Yuri Cerqueira, so the one I mentioned before, an influential pedagogue and general inspector of education, clearly demonstrate how such views made their way into writing instructional discourse in the 1880s and 1890s. In his Méthode pratique de langage, de lecture et d'écriture, de calcul, etc., which was one of the methods to be specifically used in the provinces that didn't speak mainly French, he describes writing as a complement to reading and language lessons and argued that, which was something really new for handwriting instruction books, if at first the child writes in an incorrect, inelegant strokes, that is not an issue and will be corrected later when it comes the time to practice beautiful writing, or as they say, calligraphy. So towards the end of the century, there is this sort of divorce between writing instruction and calligraphy. Calligraphy will be this time accepted as something to be introduced only later in the process. With education becoming compulsory in the 1880s with the Ferry Law, the goal of streamlining the spread and unification of the written and spoken language of the nation became prominent in educational policy, discourse, and practice. Therefore, Carré proposed a method focused on his new version of the French roundhand, claiming to have simplified it by eliminating useless and complicated traces. The result is indeed notably simpler than the complex series of hands we have observed, for instance, in Taupier's method earlier in the century. Therefore, throughout the century, multiple factors contributed to propelling simpler approaches to handwriting: the development of pedagogical debates, the dynamic educational and publishing landscape, the expanding and compulsory schooling system, the accelerated needs of French modern society, and the political and ideological pressures on national and imperial unity. As Antoine Proust argued in his classic overview of education in France, the shift towards a more utilitarian view of scribal education was an overarching process in the 19th century. Carré's late works point to yet another important aspect of how educational discourse on writing changed as the 19th century ended, and this is the last section of my talk. In 1893, he prefaced Dr. Émile Javal, La lecture enseignée par l'écriture. As an engineer and member of the Academy of Medicine, Émile Javal approached writing from a medical perspective, following the latest hygienist debates and defending, for instance, a general verticality for the shape of the script, for the positioning of the body, and for the arrangement of the writing surface. When, in 1897, Carré co-authored a pedagogical treatise with Roger Liquier, director of the École Normale d'Avignon, The dialogue between pedagogical and scientific discourse, as well as the divergence from the calligraphic approach to penmanship, appeared to be further reinforced. In his lengthy and systematic text, psychological principles are presented as the theoretical foundation of the educational process, complementing the practical aspects of teaching. In the author's own words, they intended to present in the clearest form the psychological truths which contain, in a certain way, the general principles in which a rational pedagogy is derived. In reading the works of Carré and other contemporaries, we can thus understand why the historian Philippe Artière saw in the late 19th century a turning point in writing education. For him, this is a moment when writing pedagogy becomes more clearly informed by the medical and experimental research that made writing the object of a new form of knowledge. I may perhaps be more inclined to see this influence as a dialogue rather than a mere incorporation of scientific discourse into education. The fertile and dynamic instructional debate reflected in the plethora of writing instruction publications that we saw here, and marked by an intense political interest and economical interest as well in the matter, may also have propelled experimental and scientific approaches such as physiology, neurology, medicine, and psychology to turn their attention to writing. However, regardless of how one may view the complex scenario of educational thought, Artière's works show that, as relevant as it may have been, instructional discourse was not the only field concerned with the debate on the power, nature, and function of handwriting. Other modes of inquiry on writing were equally present or emergent. Indeed, among the attempts to rationalize, understand, and shape scribal knowledge, the realms of science, graphology, literature, and media equally produce rich and diverse discourses that influence and reflect how handwriting was perceived in the 19th century. My forthcoming book intends to explore those areas to provide a broader understanding of the cultural history of writing in 19th century France. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions and suggestions.